Hello, you're welcome. You're welcome onto my channel today, and it gives me great joy to observe you are viewing this video. I'm Professor Olayinka Akanle. I'm a lecturer in the university. I'm a sociologist. On this channel, I do a number of studies. For all these studies I do, you can easily cluster them into four, and sociology and research are very central to them. Today, I'm going to be talking about Karl Marx. Wonderful. You're going to be very explosive, and you have to stay tuned. It may be a little extended compared to my previous videos, and just because Karl Marx is one of the most phenomenal, most strategic, most revolutionary, most pragmatic thinkers of his generation, whose impacts can still be felt today in social sciences, humanities, and beyond. Meanwhile, if you have not subscribed to this channel, kindly go ahead and click subscribe on your screen right now to join my family of subscribers. Click subscribe. Tap subscribe button on your screen right now. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, reigned in the 19th century, and he was born in modern-day Germany and died in modern-day London, that's in England. But throughout the period of Karl Marx, he was so profoundly different from many of his generation. Looking at Engels, looking at a lot of other people that they reigned together, it was a bit different among them because he was very pragmatic. He was forceful about his thought. Unlike people you will talk about, like maybe even Ibn Khaldun, even August Comte, Taco Parsons, Emile Durkheim, and Max Weber, and the rest of them. Don't forget, this video is within the series of founding fathers of sociology, contributors to sociology. Even though, unlike Comte, unlike Emile Durkheim, unlike Max Weber, Karl Marx was never primarily a sociologist. No. But we only find his ideas very tangentially and strategically, directly or indirectly relevant in sociology. And that's why we are appropriating his ideas in sociology. So, but you cannot teach sociology today without teaching or learning the thoughts of Karl Marx. Karl Marx can be described as a philosopher, historian, economist, social crusader, philosopher. So, he was a man with so many angles because of his strategic contribution, because of the multiplicity of his ideas. So, and that is very important because this multiplicity of his ideas actually made him to be considered among the most controversial philosophers, thinkers of his time, because his ideas were very thought-provoking and very revolutionary. And when somebody or someone is revolutionary, questioning the status quo, he will tend to be very controversial. And that's why, he moved away from Germany at the point and moved to, England for different reasons. And he was also advocating, socio-political change, revolution, structural disruptions for progress. He was interested in social change. That because he was tired of the oppression of his time in the 19th century. Don't forget that all this also talked about the founding fathers and the origin of sociology. He was tired of the inequality, injustice of his period, and he was looking for a way to get a more egalitarian and a more equitable society. This is you have to understand this. And that's why he was also talking about conflict. In fact, Karl Marx can be regarded as the founding father of the conflict perspective in sociology. Meanwhile, there's a video on this channel on Marxism. Marxism talks about the perspective, the theoretical orientations of Karl Marx. View that video. In fact, you cannot sufficiently enjoy this video or have a total understanding of this video or Karl Marx without viewing the video on Marxism, which I've dropped before now. Though not within the series of founding fathers or contributors, but it was in my series on theories and perspective. And two major findings of Karl Marx, you talk about Das Kapital, or what's commonly known as capital, in English. And the most profound, the most impactful of his thought, through which you can easily understand the social revolutionary perspective, was the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto. Well, it was not a book. It was like a pamphlet, and he wrote it with Friedrich Engels. He wrote Capital, and then he co-authored the pamphlet on the Communist Manifesto with Friedrich Engels. And from this Capital and the Communist Manifesto, You could easily see through the mind of Karl Marx. Through these two volumes, these two publications, strategically compressed all his ideas. In fact, all we know about Karl Marx could be traced through his writings on the Communist Manifesto and the Capital. And if you look at it, it was looking more towards explaining what was happening in society and why this were happening and what should be done. So it was not like an armchair theorizing compared to other thinkers. It was theorizing, it was philosophizing, at the same time giving, a direction, a pathway towards achieving the change that he was actually looking for. And I will now tell you about his main contributions. And you have to follow me very closely. I will synthesize his main contributions in a way that you will be able to understand what a major contribution of Karl Marx was what is commonly called historical materialism. Historical materialism, where Karl Marx was tracing the history of our society. And that's where you find these very common quotations that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. He was tracing the history of all societies, different societies, until it got to capitalism, that you could understand the struggle between classes, the people who have the rich and the poor. He called the rich the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production. I will talk about this later. And the proletariat, the poor, who are involved in production processes through the sale of their labor, and they get wages. So he was saying the conflict, talking about the history of our society is driven by material conditions. That all societies have their history and progresses and changes within the material conditions in their time in history, talking about the mode of production and the relation of production. Mode of production talks about the predominant strategy through which societies produce their needs, products, and services. The dominant structure, the dominant approach, the dominant system through which societies in history produce what they need to survive. And this is what we call mode of production. And I'll tell you different modes of production later on. Stay tuned. Then within this dominant modes of production, you have what we call, Karl Marx call relations of production, which talks about how people in production processes relate among themselves. Especially from the perspective of Karl Marx, if you break it into people who owns the modes of production, the employers, the modes of production, the owners, and those who don't own, those are the laborers who sell their labor in production processes. So in a capitalist system, you have the people who have the factories, who have the machines. What Karl Marx called the forces of production later on. This is what they call means of production in economics, in contemporary economics. But Karl Marx considered this one forces of production. These are things that are brought together in production of goods and services. You talk about the technology, you talk about the product, you talk about the land, you talk about the fund, the capital. The only thing separated by Karl Marx was actually the labor, which the poor people contribute in the production processes. I hope you are following this. It's a bit interwoven, but I'll break it down. So these modes of production are the structures through which, or arrangement, organizations, processes through which goods and services are produced. These modes of production. Relations of production talk about how people in the production processes relate among themselves. Essentially taking it vertically, hierarchically, talking about the interactions between the people who owns the means of production, the rich, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat, the poor who don't own the means of production, who sell their labor to earn wages in the production processes. For Karl Marx, they bring class struggles. The upper class, the owners of means of production, the lower class, the people who don't own means of production, who sell their labor. So for Karl Marx, what you have is constant antagonism in society, because the owners of means of production continue to exploit the people who don't own means of production, and the people who don't own means of production are continually exploited, and they will be continue to rebel, antagonize their oppressors. And for Karl Marx, in the long run, this class antagonism will continue until there is overthrow of the bourgeoisie, the exploiters, by the poor who sell their labor. And this constant antagonism will become full-scale conflict that will lead to revolution. And this revolution will usher in a new direction that will then lead to overthrow of capitalism. And capitalist mode of production will be overthrown. It will lead to socialism, where the state will own everything on behalf of the others. Eventually, socialism will give way to communism, through which everybody will own everything on behalf of everybody, to everybody according to his needs at that point in time. And for Karl Marx, capitalism is the ultimate end. Communism is the ultimate end after capitalism. For Karl Marx, capitalism of its own time and today can be considered as inhumanity of humans to humans. Humans oppressing humans, because it's all about capital accumulation, the rich of the rich and continuous poor of the poor. So for Karl Marx, capitalism was evil until today, evil according to Karl Marx, because it's based on exploitation and capital accumulation, where the rich continue to accumulate capital at the expense of everybody, at the exploitation of the poor. And for Karl Marx, these poor people will transform from class in itself as a form of identity to class for itself, where they will build class consciousness to antagonize, to fight against the oppressors, the people who want the means of production, to overthrow them and take over the society. And society will become more equitable. And don't forget, it was also the period of the Cold War. View my channel videos on the sociology of the Third World. You will understand what I mean by Cold War. A time where Soviet Union, was an example of a communist society, where the United States and the West are considered examples of capitalism. So Karl Marx was looking at Europe and America as an example of capitalism that must be overthrown, where there must be a society like the Soviet Union, where communism was reigning supreme. And this was actually the model that Karl Marx was propagating, that the overthrow of the rich, like in the US and Europe and the rest of them, and to transformation to examples given by the Soviet Union, USSR. That would be around contemporary Russia. But Russia itself, USSR got disintegrated after the Cold War, during the Cold War. And now the model that Karl Marx was using is no longer visible. That's why people are continually criticized Karl Marx and Marxism, that is being criticized to extinction. Because even the model he was looking at, the USSR, has disintegrated. And many in the USSR have moved towards even the capitalist society. And even the current Russia and China, that one can still be looking at as a communist societies, are themselves drawing closer to capitalist elements. If you look at China today, you look at Russia, to what extent can we say they are essentially communist? Because all we can see in capitalist society can be seen in those places too. And that's why some people say capitalism has won compared to what Karl Marx was pushing. So I've wrapped so many things in my explanation. So now I've explained historical materialism, but in my explanation I've moved to other areas. But I will break them down now, but I'll be faster, so that this video does not become too lengthy. So, and I've mentioned the issue of modes of production, which is a major contribution of Karl Marx. Modes of production, I've explained it as dominant structures, strategies, process through which societies produce what they need in terms of goods and services. And what are these modes of production in history? Especially if you want to take it back to the issue of historical materialism. What are the historical societies that have existed, that have been driven by material conditions and determined by material conditions? Now you have one, primitive communism at a very primitive level, different from what Karl Marx was pushing. Then you have slavery, slave societies, where the articles of trade were human beings, where people are sold into slavery. Then from primitive communism to slavery, then to feudalism, where land is the major article. You can say, okay, primitive communism as a mode of production, you can say slavery as a mode of production, you can also say feudalism as a mode of production, where land was the article of trade. You still have the element of this today, where you have the two classes, the two categories of people, the lords, are also known as the nobles. Then you also have the peasants, also known as the serfs. The lords own the land, the nobles own the land, then the peasants and the serfs work on the land as a lower class who don't own land, which was the means of production, and they work on the land and they pay royalties in different ways. They serve the lords by tilting the land and producing, and pay royalties, rents, or other things to service that relationship. Then after feudalism, Karl Marx talked about capitalism, which was actually the major issue of interest in his own time, where you have now the modes of production, industrialization. Don't forget, originating from social disorganization and the rest of it. Societies must produce to survive, to meet its needs. Capitalism is private ownership of means of production and wealth in the hands of the few. And Karl Marx believed that because of the constant antagonism, like I've explained, between the owners of means of production, the upper class, and the bourgeoisie, and the people who sell their labor without means of production, but sell their labor in the means of production, will continue to antagonize. And this will lead to revolution that will change the structure of society to socialism, where state owns everything. Then again, after that, to communism, where everybody owns everything, in everyone according to his needs. So these are the modes of production, and these are the approaches. Then for Karl Marx, there's also the concept of economic determinism, where Karl Marx believed that the economic superstructure determines the role of people in society and the class of people. That whether your level, whether you own the means of production or not, will determine your class, your status, and the opportunities available to you in that society. So in simple time, economic position, economic ownership will determine every other thing in that society, whether you have power, whether you have influence, whether you have authority, whether you have quality of life, will be determined by your position in the economic system, in the mode of production. That is, do you own the means of production or you don't? If you own, you are higher class. If you don't, you are poor and you are in the lower class. It talks about the class struggle, which is, there have been argument that Karl Marx never mentioned class. But we know you can't discuss class, whether from his original ideas or later on as neo-Marxist. Class is central to the issue of Karl Marx. When you discuss it, that is, which class do you belong? There are two classes in society. Don't forget I spoke to you about Weber in the video on Weber. Weber believed in the multi-dimensional approach to class. Don't go and view that video. That you may not have means of production, but you may have charisma or authority or traditional authority. But for Karl Marx, there are two classes only: upper class, lower class, bourgeoisie, proletariat, rich and poor, depending whether you have the means of production or you don't own it. So constant class antagonism, class struggle between the rich and the poor is a major element, contribution of Karl Marx. There's also the issue of alienation. Alienation, is a major concept for Karl Marx, where he talks about the estrangement of workers, even though they work in the means of within the mode of production, but they are alienated. They don't own themselves. Their existences within the mode of production is determined by the rich. They are alienated from their product. They produce goods and services, but they don't have control over it. Some of them, they cannot even use it because it's too expensive for them. Even they are not in control of their labor, because in some places they have to clock in and clock out. Their labor, even they are separated from themselves. They don't have control over themselves. So their total identity and entirety is owned by the rich in the mode of production. People who own the forces of production. Forces of production is a major contribution, talking about what is brought together in the production processes to produce goods and services. I've told you technology, talk about capital, you talk about machines, you talk about even land and the rest of it. Labor is the only thing that is now appropriated, and people are exploited through that. So alienation is a major concept. Have a conflict perspective, talking about conflict that must ensue because of the class struggle. So I have a video on conflict perspective on this channel. View that video. So we generally believe that Karl Marx can be regarded as the father of critical sociology. When we talk about when you begin to analyze power struggles, begin to analyze inequality, whether along gender or economy. So that's what we mean, critical sociology, talking about struggle, political struggle, power struggle, and struggle for authority and control of resources. So he's the father of class theory. He was the father of critical sociology, talking about conflict and crisis and the rest of it, and class struggle, talking about class and class structure in society. I've mentioned all of this. Then he's also talking about communism, and socialism. They also talk about, forces of production I've mentioned. He spoke about relations of production, where the relationship in the production process between the haves and the have-nots, and the fact that class will transfer from class in itself, in terms of identity, to class for itself, that they will come together and organize and overthrow. But that has not happened. And it's not looking like, because capitalism is gaining more grand, and communism has disintegrated. But it's talking about surplus value too. Surplus value for Karl Marx is what is considered as the unpaid fee, unpaid salary, unpaid wages for labor. Is the excess that's supposed to be given, money that's supposed to be given to laborers that the owners of Mr. refuse to pay them by underpaying them. That's what it calls surplus value. But this is what is called profit in economics or even in business. It's called profit. But for Karl Marx, there's something like profit. He believed that it's a result of exploitation. This is money that will have been paid to the people in the lower class in the production processes. But the owners of means of production, the rich, refuse to pay and continue to accumulate capital for their own benefit by underpaying the workers. The money that is not paid to the workers enough, that's what they call profit. And Karl Marx believes this is not profit. It's called surplus value. Value of labor that was not paid sufficiently and they are exploited. So for Karl Marx, no profit. What it is surplus value. It's as a result of exploitation. Exploitation by overusing labor and underpaying labor, through which the rich, the owners of this production, continue to accumulate capital. So I've mentioned force of production, I've mentioned relations of production, I've mentioned surplus value, I've mentioned capital accumulation, I've mentioned modes of production, I've mentioned historical materialism, I've mentioned alienation. All of this, Marxism unraveled. View the video on conflict perspective, view the video on Marxism, and you will become professor of Marxism. Welcome to Karl Marx. Till I see you in my next video, thank you for keeping my company so far. Click subscribe. Till I see you in my next video, bye for now.